Hello everyone, my name is Ivan Netkachev, and today I would like to talk about the floating of quantifiers in Indonesian language. I will focus on some undocumented properties of quantifier float in standard Indonesian. And let me first mention my data sources straight away. I worked with two educated native speakers of Indonesian from Jakarta, and also I've analyzed some written texts in standard Indonesian, so some texts found in various media. And also let me make my main points straight away. First, I will show you that in Indonesian, what has been previously called floating quantifiers is in fact right dislocation in the sense of Denisot. And also there are indeed floating quantifiers in Indonesian, but their usage is kind of restricted because they can only occur with unaccusative predicates, and they cannot occur in clauses with any other kind of predicate. And thirdly, I show that there is a possible explanation for this, and it lies in the fact that the sole argument of unaccusative predicates is base generated as VP internal argument. And when the floating of quantifiers occurs, the noun is moved to the left periphery of the clause, while the quantifier remains in situ, so it gets stranded. And that's how, well, the floating quantifier constructions are generated. And this also explains why this is only accessible with unaccusative predicates, but we'll discuss it soon. Okay. First, let us define what are floating quantifier constructions. Simply, or I'd say straightforwardly, those are constructions whereby the quantifiers are separated from the nominals over which they quantify, as in one. You can see that the noun phrase, the students, is separated from the universal quantifier all by the auxiliary verb. So this is a sentence with a floating quantifier all. Well, the floating of quantifiers is attested not only in English or other Indo-European languages, but in Southeast Asian languages too, and in Malayo-Polynesian languages as well. For instance, you can find it in Balantak. In two, you can see that two coordinate noun phrases are separated from the universal quantifier by the main clause predicate. So the woman's parents and her siblings are separated from the universal quantifier all by the main verb eat. And you can also find similar examples in yet another Malayo-Polynesian language, Nias. So here in 3, you can see that the quantifier 6, together with the classifier, occurs to the left periphery of the clause, while the noun occurs after the main clause predicate. Okay, so the question is whether there are floating quantifiers in Indonesian language. And some authors claim that, yes, there are indeed floating quantifiers in Indonesian as well. So they're possible like with any predicates. For instance, in 4, you can see that the numeral together with the classifier tiga ekor is separated from the nominal sapi, cow, by the adverb yesterday. And Peter Jenks claims that this is a perfectly felicitous sentence. And so this is a sentence with floating quantifiers in Indonesian. However, it appears that the picture is not that simple. It appears that the examples that have previously been shown, the examples of floating quantifiers, are in fact sentences involving right dislocation. So my consultants reject sentences like the one in 4. So they claim that this is not grammatical. So they cannot pronounce the sentence as a single intonation unit. However, if you make a pause before the quantifier, in this case, before the numeral or the numerative complex, the sentence becomes perfectly grammatical. And it translates as, I bought cows yesterday. In fact, 3 cows. In other words, in Jenks's sentence in 4, the numerative complex or the quantifier is not in the same clause as the noun, and it cannot be treated as a floating quantifier proper. And now the question arises whether there are any floating quantifiers in Indonesian at all. So if the examples with the existing examples with floating quantifiers, in fact, do not involve the floating of quantifiers, well, maybe this language lacks the floating quantifier constructions, simply. However, one can indeed find true floating quantifiers in Indonesian. And now we will see naturally occurring data with like real floating quantifiers. Let us consider the example in 7. Here you can see that the noun phrase, so the noun together with the proximal demonstrative, burung ini, is separated from the numerative complex enam ekor by the main clause predicate, which is tinggal, remain. And this sentence is perfectly grammatical according to my consultants, and it's also found on the web. Consider also the example in 8. Here you can see that the nominal is also separated from the quantifier. So udang purba itu, that ancient shrimp, is separated from the numerative complex dua ekor, 2, together with the classifier. And again, you can see that the predicate is tinggal, the same predicate, remain. Interestingly, if one tries to right dislocate the quantifier in this kind of sentences, one will get illicit sentence. So if one tries to make a pause before the numerative complex in either of those 2 examples, they get ungrammatical. In contrast to the examples just discussed, to the examples from a paper by Peter Jenks. Yeah. I also want to know that here we've seen that those are the examples with numerals, but in fact you can substitute numerals by any other quantifier. So for instance, you can substitute the numerative complex by the quantifier sedikit, a few, and the sentence still remains grammatical. Or you can say beberapa, udang purba itu tinggal beberapa, and the sentence is still okay. Yeah. So we see that in Indonesian, in fact, the quantifier float is licit in some sentences, but ungrammatical in some other sentences. And what is the reason for this? What is the emerging generalization? I claim that the generalization is that in Indonesian, the floating quantifiers can only occur in clauses with one place unaccusative predicates. Okay, so let us briefly discuss what are unaccusative predicates. Well, intransitive verbs can be either unaccusative or unergative. Unergative verbs have a subject but no object. Well, kind of, informally speaking. Unaccusative verbs, by contrast, have an object but no subject, a deep structure. And this somehow correlates with the semantics of the verb. For instance, the verbs with an agentive subject are prototypically unergative, while the verbs with patient or experiencer subject are prototypically unaccusative. However, this is just a mere correlation. So this is not the rule. It is not the case that like all the verbs with experiencer subjects are unaccusative in all languages. One should still find some syntactic distributional diagnostics for unaccusativity in a given language. And in Indonesian, there is indeed such a diagnostic. So there are works by Vamarasi and Nomoto, and there you can find that there is a diagnostic. In fact, there is just one working diagnostic which works like in more or less in all the cases. The only argument of an unaccusative verb aligns with the object of a transitive clause derived from the same stem by the affix, I'd say circumfix men kan. And by contrast, the subject of an unergative verb patterns with the subject of the corresponding transitive clause. So we'll see briefly how it works. For instance, in 13, you can see that the main verb is tidur, sleep. He sleeps on a straw mat, and this is an intransitive clause, but we can sort of transitivize this verb by adding prefix men and suffix and the suffix kan. And in this case, you can see that the former subject in 13, he or she, becomes the object. So mother put her child to sleep. So here you can see that the sleeper is not mother, it's the child, the grammatical object. So here you can see that the sole argument of a one place predicate patterns with the object of a corresponding transitive clause. So this shows us that tidur, sleep, is an unaccusative verb. By contrast, the verb berpikir, so the stem is pikir. Oh, here some problem with spaces, but no matter what. And here you can see that in 15, the subject is the thinker. So he thought a long time before he chose a wife. In 16, if we try to make a transitive verb from the same verbal stem, the subject is still the thinker. So the grammatical subject. And this shows us actually that the verb berpikir is an ergative and not an accusative. And now let us return to the floating quantifiers. I suggest that, once again, I'll repeat it. I suggest that the floating of quantifiers is possible only with unaccusative predicates and impossible with any other kinds of predicates. According to the diagnostic, which we've discussed recently, tingle remain is an accusative, and that's why it allows for the floating of quantifiers. I have no time for like showing you the testing procedure for the verb tingle, but you just have to believe me that it is indeed an accusative. But let us now check other unaccusative predicates: lari, run, muncul, appear, and datang, come. So will they allow for the floating of quantifiers, or maybe they won't? Well, it appears that all of them allow for the floating of quantifiers. In 17, the main predicate is lari, run, and well, the floating of quantifiers is perfectly okay. In 18, the main clause predicate is muncul, and so the nominal occurs clause initially, while the quantifier occurs clause finally, and the whole sentence is okay. Also know that this will be pretty important for my analysis, that in those kind of examples, in the examples with floating quantifiers, the quantifier, or in this case the numerative complex, is focused, which is in fact suggested by the context, by the current question under discussion provided here. However, the nominal, which occurs clause initially, is topicalized. Yeah, and now let's consider the final example with an accusative predicate, which is datang, come. And here, once again, this sentence is perfectly grammatical. So the nominal occurs clause initially, the quantifier clause finally, and it's okay. Let us now consider transitive verbs. Well, we've already seen that transitive verbs do not allow for the floating of quantifiers. So you can see the example in 4, repeated here as 20. Sapi is separated from the numerative complex by the adverb, and this is ungrammatical. And here you can see yet another example of floating quantifiers with transitive verbs. Here, the transitive verb is bertemu, meet, and in fact, it is not. In fact, the quantifier cannot occur after this noun phrase, because the demonstrative here is the rightmost element of the noun phrase. So no NP modifiers can occur after that, and tiga orang cannot be a floating quantifier in this case, because this predicate is transitive. You can say like you can make a pause before the quantifier, as in 22, and the sentence becomes perfectly okay. But without this pause or a comma, this is not grammatical. Yeah, and finally, let us check for unergative verbs. What about them? Well, they do not allow for the floating of quantifiers neither. For instance, barnyani, sing, is an ergative verb. Here, the nominal occurs clause initially, the quantifier clause finally, and the sentence is ungrammatical. In 24, there is another unergative verb, which is bekerja, and once again, the floating of quantifiers is ungrammatical. Okay, so we see that my generalization holds. So the floating of quantifiers is only possible with unaccusative predicates and impossible with transitive verbs or unergative verbs. Now, let me try to suggest a possible analysis for this phenomenon. I'd say even sketch out a possible analysis. There is yet another language in which has similar restrictions on quantifier float, and this language is Japanese. It was shown by Miyagawa in 1989 that a quantifier float is listed with unaccusatives, but illicit with unergatives. This holds in Indonesian as well, and I want to suggest an analysis in the spirit of Miyagawa. So I claim that we observe those restrictions on quantifier float simply because the subjects of unaccusative verbs are base generated as VP internal arguments, while the subjects of unergatives are not, so they are VP external. Now I will show you in brief how this works. Well, so the subject of an accusative predicate is base generated as a VP complement, and after that, the head of the noun phrase or like the part of the nominal undergoes movement to the left periphery of the clause. And this movement is motivated by topicalization of the noun. However, the quantifier phrase does not undergo movement because it is not topicalized. It gets stranded or it remains in situ. And this is how those constructions with floating quantifiers are generated. So let us consider the example in 25. Here you can see that the noun phrase dua orang tamu, two guests, is base generated VP internally as a complement of the verb datang, come. After that, the noun tamu gets topicalized and it moves. And it moves in a position where topics occur. And here I assume that this position is the specifier of TP. It moves there. However, the rest of the noun phrase, in this case, the quantifier, gets stranded. And that's how the whole sentence is generated. And this, in fact, explains why the quantifier float is impossible with unergative predicates. Simply because in sentences with unergative predicates, the sole argument is base generated on the left of the verb. So the sole argument of an accusative verb would be somewhere here. So it would be impossible for the main clause predicate to intervene between the quantifier and the noun, unless we postulate some additional movements, but well, there are no motivations for doing so. In the case of transitive verbs, there is indeed an internal argument which occurs to the right of the verb. However, there is also an external argument, and it occupies the specifier of TP already. So there is an argument which is already there in the specifier of TP. And that's why movement there is impossible. And that's why the constructions with floating quantifiers cannot be generated. Okay, so this is pretty much all. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I'd be very happy to receive any comments or suggestions. You can just email me. And so thank you. Have a good day.